Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight let's imagine the career fair from hell. No PowerPoint slides, no polite HR reps offering branded pens. Just a mud-caked town square in the year 1350, where you're desperately trying to avoid starvation, plague, or falling into a moat. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from a faraway place or at some absurd hour, leave a comment and let me know. I love seeing where all the sleepy historians are tuning in from. Now dim the lights, turn on that comforting fan or white noise, and drift with me into the grimy world of medieval employment. Because while we often picture the Middle Ages as swords, castles, and maybe a well-aimed trebuchet, the reality was far more stinky and remarkably underpaid. Tonight, we'll meet the people who kept medieval society running, not with glory, but with bare hands, bad smells, and a level of personal discomfort that would make a modern HR department spontaneously combust. So if you think your job is bad now, just wait until we get to the guy whose job it was to clean royal bottoms. Let's start with something delightfully foul. Meet the gong farmer. Not a musical profession despite the misleading name. Gong in this context is a delightful Old English term for, well, poop. And a gong farmer was the lucky soul hired to remove it. All of it. Imagine you're walking through a medieval town. It smells like a blend of wet hay, livestock, and despair. You pass a row of timbered houses and suddenly someone shouts, "Garde l'eau!" That's Old French for, "Watch out for the water." Except the water in question is not water. It's human waste, and it's now cascading out of a second-story window like some kind of Dark Ages waterfall. And when that waste didn't end up on your head, it collected underground in cesspits, hidden beneath homes, behind taverns, sometimes directly under castle toilets. These pits slowly filled with the worst leftovers of medieval life. And who had the job of crawling into these pits, often at night, armed with only a shovel, a bucket, and the vague promise of a few coins? Gong farmers. They worked in the dark, under cover of moonlight, partly because it was cooler, but mostly because the stench was so powerful in daylight it could knock out a cow. They wore rough leather garments, stuffed herbs up their noses, and prayed constantly that no one upstairs decided to use the privy mid-shift. The contents of these pits were hauled out by hand, loaded into carts, and dumped outside the city, or sometimes, creatively, sold to farmers as fertilizer. Recycling, medieval style. Despite the horror of the job, gong farmers were surprisingly well paid. You had to be, no one did this for fun. Some even became oddly respected, like the trash collectors of the apocalypse. If you were a gong farmer and didn't die of infection, you could retire slightly richer than your equally miserable neighbors, but you'd never be truly welcome at a feast. Let's move on to someone who didn't get paid well and didn't smell better. Now let's wade, literally, into another delightfully unpleasant career, the leech collector. Imagine your local swamp, not the scenic kind with singing frogs and filtered Instagram shots. I mean a medieval bog, reeking of stagnant water and buzzing with things that want to bite you. Now picture someone wading into that swamp barefoot, lifting their hem, and gently letting dozens of bloodthirsty leeches cling to their legs. That's the job. Why? Because medieval medicine had one big idea. If you're sick, it's probably because your bodily humors are out of balance. Too much blood? Easy fix. Remove some. With leeches. And someone had to supply those squirming little lifesuckers to every apothecary, barber surgeon, and physician in town. Enter the leech collector. This brave soul would go into marshes and let leeches attach to their own body. Once the leeches were full of blood, they were plucked off and stored in clay jars, ready for resale to doctors and pessimistic monks. Some used old meat or animals to lure them in, but many just offered themselves up as the buffet. The result? Permanent scarring, frequent infections, and a blood iron level that probably made you faint if someone opened a window too fast. Leech collecting was mostly done by women and the desperately poor. It was easy to enter the profession. All you needed was access to a swamp, a high pain tolerance, and no better options. The leeches themselves were medieval celebrities. People believed they could cure anything from gout to headaches to demonic possession. And they stayed in medical use until well into the 19th century, because nothing beats centuries of sticky tradition. So yes, while today's job listings might demand Excel skills and 5 years of experience, back then, you just needed legs, a swamp, and very little regard for personal safety. Let's towel off and meet someone who smelled different, but somehow worse. Ah, the executioner. One of the few medieval jobs that came with guaranteed job security, a terrifying reputation, and absolutely no dinner party invitations. Let's be honest, medieval Europe was really into punishments. Public hangings, beheadings, drawing and quartering, breaking on the wheel. They didn't just sentence you, they performed justice. And the person in charge of all this theatrical death? The executioner. But here's the strange part. Despite being crucial to the justice system, executioners were social outcasts. Why? Because handling the bodies of the condemned, and more importantly, spilling blood, made you ritually unclean in the eyes of the church. That meant no attending church services, no marrying respectable townsfolk, and definitely no front row seats at the May Day fair. You were feared, needed, and avoided all at once. The job itself was surprisingly technical. A good executioner was expected to dispatch their victim quickly and cleanly, especially in beheadings. If you botched the job and needed more than one swing of the axe, the crowd might riot, or worse, the condemned might curse you with their final breath. In an age when curses were taken seriously, that was a genuine career hazard. Some executioners wore hoods, not to be spooky, but to protect their identity. Others didn't bother. Everyone knew who they were anyway. You couldn't exactly hide your profession when your backyard was full of condemned criminal bones. Still, the perks were unusual. Executioners were often allowed to keep the clothes, shoes, or coins of the condemned. They might even double as torturers, body disposers, or, in quieter weeks, animal control officers. Versatility was the name of the game. But the job took a toll. Some executioners lived outside city limits, their children denied apprenticeships in other trades, their families trapped in a cycle of blood-soaked employment. And yet, the job paid relatively well, perhaps the only reason anyone took it. So the next time you hear someone say, "I'd kill for that job," just remember, in the Middle Ages, someone actually did. Now let's meet someone who worked with death too, but only after it happened. If you've ever complained that your job eats away at your soul, let me introduce you to a medieval gig where that was quite literal. Enter the sin eater, a person hired to absorb the sins of the recently deceased by eating bread over their corpse. Yes, you heard that right. The sin eater's job was simple in theory, deeply strange in practice, and spiritually horrifying if you thought too hard about it. When someone died, often suddenly, often without a priest on hand, their family might panic. What if the dearly departed hadn't confessed all their sins? What if they were currently hovering near hell's waiting room with a full moral suitcase? Solution: call the sin eater. This person, often poor and already semi-outcast, would be summoned to the wake. They'd be handed a piece of bread, sometimes cheese or ale if the family was feeling generous, and asked to eat it over the body, sometimes placed on the chest of the corpse, while muttering a short prayer. The idea was that the sins of the dead would pass into the food and then into the sin eater, which meant this person was now walking around carrying someone else's guilt, like a human USB stick full of spiritual malware. Understandably, sin eaters weren't exactly beloved. They were tolerated, pitied, and occasionally stoned. But they provided a service, especially in rural communities without easy access to a priest. They were considered necessary but spiritually radioactive. And it didn't stop at one body. These folks could do several jobs in a week. Imagine the psychological toll of consuming the sins of your neighbors on a regular basis, while also being excluded from church, festivals, and even polite conversation. No one wanted to sit next to the person who just ate Uncle Henry's adultery. The origins of sin eating are murky. It's mostly associated with parts of Wales and the English borderlands. But similar rituals appear in various folk traditions across Europe. Officially, the church disapproved. Unofficially? It continued for centuries, especially among the poor. Ironically, the sin eater was usually the most burdened soul in town, but the only one offering final absolution. Let's move now to a more lively job. One that involved performance, risk, and a working knowledge of rabid animals. Let's take a break from the gloom of death and step into the festive, blood-splattered world of medieval entertainment. And at the center of this highly questionable fun, the bear word. A person whose entire job was to handle a live, usually angry bear, for crowds, for laughs, for culture. Yes, in the centuries before Netflix, medieval people had to get creative with how they passed time. And nothing said good, wholesome fun, like watching a massive predator chained to a post, fending off dogs in a town square while people placed bets and children waved sticks. The bear word was the keeper, trainer, and reluctant best friend of these animals. They traveled from village to village, often as part of a troop, with a bear or two in tow. Their job? Keep the bear alive, mean, and just tame enough not to murder everyone. It was like managing a celebrity with claws and no filter. Bear baiting was exactly as brutal as it sounds. The bear would be chained in a pit or ring, and dogs, often specially bred mastiffs, were released to attack it. The audience cheered, dogs barked, the bear roared, and somewhere off to the side, the bearward prayed their pet didn't suddenly remember it had teeth and unresolved feelings. To keep the bear manageable, bearwards employed a mix of intimidation, starvation, and brutal training. Some bears were muzzled, others had their claws removed. The bearward's toolkit was a grim mix of iron chains, sticks, and dried fruit for the good days. And the bear, it hated all of it. Despite the cruelty, bearwards were paid entertainers. In bigger cities, they even performed for royalty. Henry VIII loved bear baiting, because of course he did, and maintained a royal bear garden in London. Imagine your tax money funding a bear fight. Oh wait, it kind of still does, just in different forms. The bearward walked a fine line. If the bear escaped and mauled someone, it was his fault. If the bear died, he was out of work. If the crowd got bored, he might be the next one chained up for entertainment. It was show business, medieval style, brutal, bizarre, and entirely lacking in workplace safety regulations. Let's leave the bloodied arenas and head somewhere quieter. Specifically, the bell tower. But beware, the job there is less musical and more spine-destroying. In the grand cathedral of medieval professions, few jobs were as audible or as quietly miserable as the bell ringer. Sounds majestic, right? Maybe you're picturing Quasimodo swinging heroically from a rope, tolling a grand bronze bell while the Paris skyline shimmers in the distance. Well, keep the rope and the spinal injury, but subtract the romance, and you've got the real deal. The bell ringer's job was deceptively straightforward. Ring the church bells on time. Every day. Multiple times a day. No alarms, no clocks. Just a medieval sundial and a stern priest breathing down your neck. You had to be awake before dawn. Ring for matins, ring for mass, ring for vespers, ring for feast days, funerals, weddings, plague outbreaks, storms, invasions, and that one kid who wouldn't stop confessing his goat thefts. Bells were not small. They were gigantic slabs of metal, sometimes weighing thousands of pounds. And ringing them wasn't just pulling a rope. It was full-body medieval CrossFit. The ringer had to haul, yank, lean, and often brace themselves like they were trying to lift a reluctant ox out of a pond. Over time, this did awful things to your body. Scoliosis, torn muscles, hernias, and, of course, hearing loss. Medieval bell towers were echo chambers. Each ring was deafening, and hearing protection back then meant praying to Saint Earplug. If you spent years up there, chances were you finished your career half-deaf, hunched over, and thoroughly fed up with every holiday that involved extra tolling. Socially, bell ringers were respected in theory. They worked for the church, after all. But they were also pitied, and sometimes feared, especially if they began to look a little too twitchy or started muttering Ave Maria under their breath every time someone coughed. Some cathedrals eventually automated their bells with weights and gears, putting many bell ringers out of work, though few of them were sad to stop yanking ropes for a living. Others stayed on as maintenance workers or bell tuners, which was essentially the same job, just with more soot. So the next time your phone alarm gives you a panic attack at 6 a.m., imagine being jolted awake by your own arms dangling from a bell rope, wondering if it's a saint's feast day or just Tuesday again. Let's now descend from the belfry and head toward a job that's more grounded, specifically under the ground. Let's talk about the gravedigger. Ah, the gravedigger. A job that never went out of fashion in the Middle Ages, largely because death never went out of fashion either. In a world where the average lifespan hovered somewhere between short and oops, graveyards weren't just busy, they were booming. Enter the gravedigger, the unsung hero of hasty funerals and plague pits, armed with a shovel, a lantern, and a haunting sense of job security. Let's clear something up. Medieval graves weren't the pristine, landscaped affairs we imagine today. There were no stone angels, no peaceful walks under willow trees, just churned earth, bad weather, and the occasional chicken poking around where it shouldn't. The job was backbreaking. Literally. Gravediggers had to dig fast, deep, and often. Standard burial required a depth of about 6 feet, not for health reasons, but mostly to discourage grave robbers and dogs. Now picture doing that with medieval tools, in frozen mud, while your co-workers are the local rats, and whatever haunted spirit just got evicted from its body. During plague outbreaks, the job got even worse. When the Black Death rolled through, graveyards couldn't keep up. Mass graves, plague pits, became the norm, and gravediggers worked around the clock, often with no protective gear except a strong stomach and a weak sense of smell. And let's talk risks. Handling corpses wasn't just gross, it was lethal. Many gravediggers caught whatever had killed the people they buried. In times of plague, their life expectancy could be measured in shovelfuls. Still, someone had to do it. The church insisted on burial, and in many towns, the only other option was, well, don't ask. Socially, gravediggers were viewed with a mix of pity and unease. They were seen as morbid, unlucky, or possibly cursed. No one wanted to marry one. Few wanted to talk to them. And yet, everyone needed them eventually. Some gravediggers doubled as bell ringers, parish clerks, or even amateur undertakers. Others drank heavily, told ghost stories, and made extra cash burying things for people who didn't want them found again. Not necessarily bodies, but not necessarily not bodies either. Despite the grimness, many found a dark pride in their work. After all, it was honest labor. It served the community. And you never had to deal with workplace gossip. The clients were very, very quiet. Let's now meet someone who worked just as closely with death, but more artistically. Next stop. The medieval plague doctor. When most people picture a plague doctor, they imagine the classic costume, wide-brimmed hat, flowing black robes, and that infamous beaked mask, like a bird that moonlights as a horror film extra. But here's the twist. Plague doctors didn't originally look like that. That outfit came later, and mostly in cities trying to look professional while everyone around them was dying. Still, by the 17th century, this was the uniform. The long beak was stuffed with herbs, spices, or vinegar-soaked cloth, not because it worked, but because it smelled better than what was outside the mask. The theory? The plague was spread by bad air, or miasma, and filtering it through a bouquet of dried roses would somehow keep your lungs clean and your soul unplagued. It didn't. Plague doctors were usually hired by towns, not by patients. They were meant to serve the public good, which meant they were often the only medical figure many poor people ever saw. Unfortunately, they weren't always trained. Some were second-rate physicians. Others were failed barbers. A few were literal volunteers, which in this context is medieval for the last guy who didn't run fast enough. Their tasks? Record the number of dead, examine symptoms, poke babos with sticks, sometimes perform autopsies, sometimes burn corpses. Occasionally, prescribe random mixtures involving mercury, crushed emeralds, or pigeon carcasses, depending on the local flavor of medical madness. Most of their treatments didn't work. But that wasn't entirely their fault. Nobody really knew how plague spread. Germ theory was centuries away. So plague doctors did what any professional would do in their situation, looked extremely confident, while absolutely winging it. The job was dangerous. Plague doctors were exposed daily to infection. Some wore waxed robes to prevent fleas from clinging. Others didn't, and died horribly. In return, they received decent pay, sometimes a pension, and often zero respect. People feared them as much as they trusted them. After all, if you saw the plague doctor coming toward your house, chances were someone inside was about to be very quiet, permanently. Despite their creepy image, plague doctors became weirdly iconic. Today they show up on Halloween costumes, heavy metal album covers, and weird internet forums. But back then, they were underpaid, overexposed, and one bad sneeze away from becoming their own patient. Ready to lighten things up a bit? Next, let's meet someone whose job was technically medical, but mostly involved poking things that didn't want to be poked. That's right, the medieval barber surgeon. Imagine walking into a medieval barber shop. You're hoping for a trim, maybe a beard tidy up. Instead, the man with the scissors turns around and says, "While you're here, shall I lance that abscess on your thigh?" Welcome to the world of the barber surgeon, a one-stop shop for grooming, minor surgery, and complete loss of faith in modern sterilization practices. In the Middle Ages, surgery was considered too low status for real physicians, who preferred to diagnose from a safe distance, possibly while stroking a beard and referencing Aristotle. So who actually performed hands-on procedures? Barbers. Yes, the same guys who shaved your face were the ones pulling your teeth, setting your bones, draining your wounds, and occasionally sawing off your leg. Barber surgeons learned their trade through apprenticeship, not medical school. Their training was largely practical, which sounds nice until you realize it meant they mostly practiced on you. They traveled with toolkits full of sharp metal, wooden clamps, and zero anesthetics, because pain was considered part of the healing process, and, let's be honest, sometimes the only thing keeping you conscious. To their credit, many barber surgeons were skilled in a way modern ER docs would respect. They could amputate quickly, stitch efficiently, and even stop bleeding using heated irons or pitch. They just couldn't promise you'd survive, or walk again, or ever trust a comb. Their shops displayed the infamous barber pole, red for blood, white for bandages. It was both a symbol of the trade and a fair warning. If you saw one outside an establishment, you knew two things. Someone just got a shave, and someone else might be missing a toe. Barber surgeons also assisted with battlefield medicine. They were the ones crawling among the wounded with a saw in one hand and a bottle of vinegar in the other, shouting, "Hold still!" while knights screamed through gritted teeth. And when not in war zones or street stalls, they might help monks with bloodletting, treat hemorrhoids, or perform minor eye surgeries. Yes, with medieval tools. And a steady hand, hopefully. Their place in society was complicated. Respected? Sometimes. Feared? Definitely. But when you had an infected wound and the local priest was busy blaming it on sin, the barber surgeon was your best and only option. Now let's pivot from slicing limbs to slicing lies. Because next, we're looking at a job built entirely on performance. The medieval alchemist. Step aside. Modern chemists. It's time for the medieval alchemist, that mysterious figure in robes who promised to turn lead into gold, cure all disease, and possibly summon the divine, all while setting things on fire in his basement. Alchemists were part scientist, part philosopher, part spiritual weirdo. Their job was to unlock the secrets of the universe using boiling flasks, cryptic symbols, and just a touch of snake oil. And while most of their experiments produced more smoke than solutions, they genuinely believed they were on the cusp of greatness. The holy grail of alchemy? The philosopher's stone? No, not the one from Harry Potter. The real philosopher's stone was a mythical substance said to transmute base metals into gold and grant eternal life. Finding it was the medieval equivalent of winning the lottery, discovering cold fusion, and becoming a saint all at once. Naturally, no one ever found it, but that didn't stop them from trying. Alchemists spent their lives grinding minerals, distilling weird liquids, and burning through noble patrons' fortunes. They scribbled in secret codes, blended astrology with metallurgy, and wrote recipes that sounded like cursed poems. Calcinate the green lion until it devours the sun and yields the red tincture. Translation: burn copper and hope for the best. Despite the mysticism, alchemists did make some real scientific contributions. They developed techniques for distillation, crystallization, and early chemical reactions. They discovered acids, documented compounds, and laid the groundwork for modern chemistry. So yes, there was method behind the madness, though occasionally the madness exploded and took the roof with it. Society viewed alchemists with suspicion and awe. Were they wise men or charlatans? Wizards or frauds? The line was blurry. Some were respected scholars. Others were arrested for fraud, especially if they failed to produce results, which of course they always did. And yes, many alchemists were con men. They'd promise a king unlimited gold, stir some glowing liquid, toss in a theatrical spark, and disappear the moment the treasury ran dry. Still, the legend endured. Even Sir Isaac Newton dabbled in alchemy, because apparently inventing calculus wasn't ambitious enough. In the end, the alchemist's greatest talent may have been persistence. They failed spectacularly, repeatedly, and expensively, but they kept trying, convinced that if they just added one more powdered unicorn horn, they'd crack the code of existence. Let's wrap up this job fair with someone who had less ambition, more mud, and a deeply tragic relationship with animals, the professional rat catcher. If you've ever had a bad day at work, take heart. You probably weren't chasing plague-ridden vermin through alleyways with a burlap sack and a prayer. Welcome to the world of the medieval rat catcher. Part pest control, part folk hero, part human flea buffet. Rats weren't just a nuisance in medieval towns. They were everywhere. They chewed through grain stores, bit sleeping children, and, most famously, played an unfortunate role in spreading the Black Death, thanks to the fleas they carried. But long before germ theory existed, no one blamed the fleas. Or the rats, really. They mostly blamed bad air. or sin, or that woman who talked to her chickens too much. Still, people knew rats were a problem, so rat catchers were hired to deal with them, usually with nothing but a sack, a stick, and a total disregard for self-preservation. Some used dogs, others trained ferrets or cats. The more ambitious ones tried poison, which sometimes worked on the rats and sometimes worked on the neighborhood children. The pay? Minimal. The respect? Also minimal. Rat catchers were often seen as dirty, unlucky, or possibly cursed, basically walking harbingers of bad hygiene. But they were also necessary. No one wanted rats, and someone had to go into the crawl spaces, crypts, and grain barns to drag them out by the tail. The job was constant. Medieval towns were built for rats, tight quarters, open garbage, and livestock wandering the streets like confused tourists. And with every new shipment of grain came a bonus infestation. So the rat catcher was always on call. Day, night, plague season, wedding season, you name it. Some got creative. Historical records mention rat catchers with musical instruments, hello, Pied Piper, trained cats on leashes, and even small-scale traps baited with rancid cheese and medieval optimism. Of course, the danger wasn't just bites. Rat catchers were exposed to diseases daily. They breathed in the dust of plague burrows. They handled infected fur with bare hands. Many didn't last long, and the ones who did often smelled like their work. Still, in the grand ecosystem of medieval labor, the rat catcher was oddly noble. They didn't save souls or invent gold, but they kept the town from vanishing into a pile of twitching fur. Let's now bring things to a soft close, with a final look at what all these strange, filthy, brave, and unlucky jobs tell us about life in the Middle Ages. Back in the Middle Ages, people believed disease sprang from imbalances in the body's fluids or humors. Blood, phlegm, black and yellow bile, the usual suspects. Uroscopy, diagnosing by urine, was considered a legitimate way to tell what your body was up to. Was your humoral balance off? Had you eaten something bad? Did you overdo the wine at last night's feast? The Piss Prophet's toolkit wasn't exciting. A flask or goblet of urine, maybe a boy or assistant to hand it over. Keen senses of smell and sight, taste if the prophet was especially bold or desperate. They'd look at the color, clear, cloudy, red, dark, pale, the consistency, the sediment. Some texts say they even listened to how it looked under the light, or how quickly bubbles rose. Yes, literally, bubbles. If it smelled badly, well, probably something was wrong. Also, certain shapes or bits floating in it were taken as signs, like, see this thick sediment? That's something unsavory. Perhaps your liver is drowning in bile, or your spleen wants attention. If you were wealthy, you paid well. If not, you hoped they were honest. Myth. Uroscopy could diagnose almost anything. Reality. It was wildly unreliable. Without knowledge of bacteria, viruses, or even proper hygiene, these readings were as good as random guesses most of the time. Someone peeing after eating beets might look like a blood in the urine case. And many diseases that do not affect urine were diagnosed via other signs, coughing, fever, and then confirmed by the Piss Prophet. Myth. Everyone trusted them. Reality. They were respected in some regions, distrusted in others. Some physicians used uroscopy as one tool among many. Others thought it superstitious. When a treatment went wrong, blame sometimes fell on them, but often just on God's will or evil vapors, because medieval thinking was messy. Myth. They always tasted the urine. Reality. This is partially true. Some sources say yes, taste was used to test sweetness or bitterness, which is horrifying, but this wasn't universal. Many uroscopists were content with visual and olfactory clues, especially if social status or decency forbade tasting. Imagine doing this job regularly. You're sniffing urine, holding flasks in dim candlelight, maybe with flies buzzing, no gloves, no masks, The smells alone would be overwhelming. Working conditions were often poor. Uroscopists often dealt with plague, and with people who had infectious disease, their knowledge of contagion was minimal. Many believed disease was in the air, vapors, or bodily fluids in some vague way, so they tried treatments like bleeding, herbs, incense, or purging the patient. Sometimes they were called to royal courts or rich households. Their social status could climb if they served someone powerful, but at the same time, the job was morally ambiguous. If you misdiagnosed, treated incorrectly, or simply scared someone with your readings, you might be blamed. As medicine progressed, uroscopy became less and less reliable compared to anatomical knowledge, microscopy, germ theory, and better diagnostic tools. Diseases that required internal observation or which did not show changes in urine forced doctors to evolve beyond peeing tests. Also, as medical schools and licensed physicians became more dominant, folk practices like uroscopy lost status or were pushed into superstition. So there you go, the piss prophet, sniffing, squinting, sometimes tasting your pee, and proclaiming your humors out of whack. It's messy, weird, sometimes useful, but mostly a reminder of how people try to understand the body with whatever clues they have. Coming up, someone whose job involved guiding the dead, literally, dealing with corpses in a more organized way than the gravedigger, the resurrectionist, body snatcher. Let's drift in that direction next. Let's imagine a quiet night in a 14th century graveyard. Fog drifts through crooked tombstones, owls hoot softly overhead, and the only sound is the faint scrape of metal on earth. No, it's not a ghost. It's a resurrectionist, someone digging up a freshly buried corpse for science. Or, let's be honest, for money. In the late Middle Ages, and especially the Renaissance, the study of human anatomy began to boom. Universities were growing. Medical schools were sprouting, and doctors were finally realizing that guessing what organs did based on astrology and goat livers wasn't cutting it. They needed real human bodies to study. Only one problem. It was illegal to dissect bodies unless you had church permission, and even then, you were usually limited to the corpses of criminals, which meant supply was low, very low. Enter the resurrectionist, part rogue, part entrepreneur, and 100% committed to getting you that cadaver you really wanted, whether the dead agreed or not. Resurrectionists operated at night, often in teams. They'd identify a fresh grave, ideally someone not yet buried too deep or decomposed. The trick was speed. They'd shovel down to the coffin, pry it open, grab the body, and then carefully rebury the clothes in the casket. Why? Because legally, it was often only a crime to steal property, not the body itself. If the grave still looked intact, fewer questions were asked. They used stretchers, sacks, carts, and sometimes bribed sextons or gravediggers to look away. Bodies were smuggled into town, stored in cellars, dissected in secret, or occasionally delivered directly to universities under tarps or barrels marked wine or fish. You can imagine how horrifying that discovery would be for the wrong tavern owner. Most resurrectionists were poor, desperate, or just cunning. They were paid per corpse. More if the body was intact and very fresh. Young male corpses fetched higher prices, because male anatomy was prioritized in medical schools. Medieval misogyny, alive and well even in death. This job was extremely risky. First of all, the dead were contagious. During plague outbreaks, exhuming a body could mean instant exposure to disease, not that anyone wore gloves or masks. Second, there were the angry relatives. Grave robbing was an offense to religious and cultural beliefs about death, rest, and the afterlife. If caught in the act, a resurrectionist might be beaten, imprisoned, or worse. Some towns began patrolling graveyards, and families hired watchers. literally people who sat near graves to keep the dead, well, dead. Third, there's the legal risk. While some doctors looked the other way or even funded the activity, others disavowed it completely. If a body was traced back to you, you might be excommunicated, jailed, or banned from the profession, especially if your dissection subject turned out to be someone politically awkward. Nobody liked resurrectionists. They were necessary, maybe, but they were whispered about, avoided in public, and considered about one notch above graveyard ghouls. Some lived in hiding. Others disguised their activities by posing as undertakers or herbalists. In literature, they were painted as villains long before Frankenstein's Igor ever arrived on the scene, and yet they helped usher in real medical understanding. Thanks to their grim trade, anatomy texts advanced, surgical techniques improved, the body stopped being mysterious and started becoming understandable. But for every textbook illustration of a liver, there was someone with mud on their boots and a body in a wheelbarrow slipping away into the fog. So next time you hear someone talk about digging deep for knowledge, remember, for some people it was quite literal and paid in whispers, coins, and a shocking number of diseases. Coming up next, let's pivot from corpses to cravings. Ever wonder who had to taste all the royal food to make sure it wasn't poisoned? Meet the court food taster, a job that's as delicious as it is potentially deadly. Ah, the royal court, a place of lavish feasts, golden goblets, and banquets lasting for hours, sometimes days. But behind all that roasted swan and endless trenchers of spiced pudding stood a single, sweaty individual with a very strange job: the food taster. Because nothing says trust issues like hiring someone whose only job is to eat your dinner before you do, just in case it's poisoned. Royal food tasters weren't just random peasants plucked from the streets and handed a spoon. Often, they were trusted servants, knights, or members of the household staff. People sworn to loyalty and willing to risk their intestines for the crown. In some courts, the role rotated. In others, it became a specialized position with prestige and a rather short life expectancy. They had to be healthy to rule out natural illnesses from interfering with the poison verdict, and have a good knowledge of symptoms. If the taster dropped dead within 10 minutes, well, guess who's skipping dessert tonight? In more elaborate setups, multiple dishes were tested. Tasters would sample a small portion of each: meats, sauces, wine, fruit. Occasionally, a physician would stand by with a smug expression, watching for signs: nausea, sweating, sudden collapse, the usual. In an age where court intrigue often came with a side of arsenic, being a taster was not symbolic. Poisoning was a popular assassination method. It was clean, discreet, and left few marks, perfect for ambitious nobles or vengeful relatives with access to the kitchen. Common medieval poisons included arsenic, tasteless and lethal in small doses. Belladonna causes hallucinations, confusion, and heart issues. Hemlock, famously used by Socrates, not recommended with soup. Cantharides, Spanish fly, burned insides like acid. And yes, it was also used as a very misguided aphrodisiac. Sometimes the poisoner wasn't even targeting the king. In some chilling tales, they went after the taster first to test dosages. You might think, well, they probably didn't die every day, right? True. Many food tasters lived long, nervous lives, constantly aware that one bad clam could ruin their entire afternoon. And poisoning was actually relatively rare, at least compared to the fear of it. But the psychological stress was constant. You were the royal canary in the coal mine, except instead of gas, it was goose liver pâté laced with monkshood. Also, food hygiene was medieval. So even when the food wasn't poisoned, it might have been spoiled. No refrigeration, lots of flies, questionable hand washing. So on any given day, the food taster might have suffered from indigestion, paranoia, or a fatal misunderstanding with a suspicious tart. As time passed and medical knowledge improved, poison paranoia shifted. Royal households developed better security, including locked kitchens, sealed wine, and trusted cooks. Eventually, the job of a taster became ceremonial, something for show, not survival. Today, a few heads of state still use tasters, though they're discreet about it. The Pope traditionally has one. U.S. presidents? Allegedly. Some celebrities too, if you believe the tabloids. But in the Middle Ages, this was very real. And very, very stressful. So the next time you nervously inspect your leftover takeout and wonder if it's still good, just be glad your job doesn't involve sniffing the royal stew and waiting to see if your heart stops. Let's pivot now to a less dangerous but equally bizarre job, the town crier, that shouting figure with a bell and a voice hoarse from yelling royal decrees. Stay tuned. Before the printing press, before newspapers, before Facebook turned your uncle into a medieval conspiracy theorist, towns and villages had the town crier, the original push notification, complete with bell, booming voice, and a profound lack of personal boundaries. In an age when most people couldn't read, and paper was more expensive than some goats, someone had to deliver the news. Not quietly, not privately, but loudly, in the middle of the street, often before sunrise. Whether you liked it or not, the town crier's job was deceptively simple. Shout things. But not just anything. These were official messages, proclamations, taxes, punishments, royal births, wartime declarations, lost sheep announcements, changes to bread prices. Anything the ruling powers wanted the public to know, the crier would, well, cry out. Each crier began with a loud, "Oyez, oyez, oyez." Derived from the Norman French for "hear ye," it was the medieval equivalent of yelling, "Listen up," at the start of a TED Talk. Except instead of talking about innovation or crypto, you were explaining why Geoff the baker just got fined for selling underweight loaves. After making their announcement, the crier would nail a copy of it to a post or the church door, the medieval version of pinning a comment. And because many people still couldn't read it, the crying part remained crucial. Criers were usually appointed by the local lord or mayor. They needed to be loud, reliable, and trustworthy. After all, you couldn't have someone accidentally declaring war on France because they had a cold and mumbled the wrong word. They were often older men, sometimes injured veterans or clerks who'd lost quieter work. In some cases, women served as criers too, particularly in market towns or ports. And despite all the yelling, the job was respectable. The crier acted with the authority of the crown or town council. Messing with a crier was like insulting a judge or attacking a postal worker. You could be fined or whipped for interrupting or threatening them. Criers were paid from local taxes, and sometimes they earned extra from public events or posting announcements for private citizens, like lost animals, debts, or wedding notices. They wore distinctive clothing, often a tabard or cloak bearing the town's crest, and carried a bell, or sometimes a drum to get attention. But the job wasn't easy. Imagine shouting at full volume, outdoors, in rain, snow, summer heat, or during market day chaos. You had no amplification, just your voice and determination. Vocal strain was a real problem, so were rotten vegetables from people who didn't want to hear about new taxes again. You also had to announce executions and public punishments, including the crimes of those being punished. "This man stole a chicken!" was yelled while said man stood in the stocks, hoping for mercy and probably being hit with turnips. With the rise of literacy and printed broadsheets, town criers became less essential. By the 18th century, they were mostly ceremonial, showing up for royal visits or festivals. But some towns in England still maintain honorary town criers today, complete with big hats and practiced lungs. So next time your phone pings a news alert, imagine it delivered by a 60-year-old man in a cloak, yelling outside your window at 6 a.m. and ringing a bell with all the urgency of a Black Friday sale. Now that we've shouted our way through public news, let's take a step into something stranger, a profession that mixed performance, public service, and pest control, the muckraker, the one who literally raked muck out of the streets, and sometimes politics too. You've heard of journalists digging up dirt on the powerful, but in the Middle Ages, the muckraker did something far more literal. They cleaned the streets by hand, with a rake, and a smile that said, "I'm just trying to survive." This was the original dirty job. No metaphors, just actual muck. Think of it as the city's human plumbing system, with none of the protection, dignity, or vacation days. The name says it all. Rake the muck. And muck, in this case, included anything and everything that ended up in the streets. Horse manure, food scraps, rotting fish, chamber pot contents, dead animals, plague rats, broken pottery, and the occasional discarded boot or tooth. Cities didn't have proper sewage systems. Many homes dumped waste directly into the street. So someone had to remove it before it turned into a full-scale swamp of disease and despair. That someone? The muckraker. Equipped with shovels, brooms, carts, and sheer existential willpower, these workers combed the alleys and market squares, sweeping muck into piles and hauling it outside the city walls. In larger towns, they might be part of a broader sanitation team. In smaller villages, it was a solo act of suffering. Some of the muck was repurposed, sold to farmers as fertilizer, used to plug holes in roads, or dumped into rivers, which then became someone else's problem. In rare cases, if you were especially unlucky, the raker might find something valuable, a lost coin, a ring, or, disturbingly often, a finger. As you can imagine, muckrakers weren't exactly beloved figures. They were tolerated, pitied, and sometimes mocked. Children threw things at them. Shopkeepers waved them away. And if you happened to stand downwind, well, people would remember. But oddly, they were essential. Without them, cities would have drowned in filth. Literally. Disease would spread faster. Rats would thrive. Streets would become impassable. And tourists, or the medieval equivalent, wandering monks and merchants, would write very rude things in their travel diaries. So while muckrakers might have smelled worse than a fishmonger's apron in July, they kept civilization walking upright. Barely. Where do we begin? Infection. Constant contact with raw sewage and decaying matter made every scratch a potential death sentence. Rats and bites, rabid dogs, fleas, and angry rodents were part of the daily routine. Collapses and cart accidents. The work was physical and exhausting. Carts were heavy, the streets were uneven, and one wrong move could leave you trampled by your own waste pile. Psychological damage. You try spending 8 hours a day ankle-deep in other people's mess and see how chipper you feel afterward. If you looked hard, very hard, the job had some upsides. You were always outside. You worked mostly alone. And occasionally, as mentioned, you might find something shiny in the muck. In fact, some muckrakers became amateur treasure hunters, keeping anything they deemed salvageable. Some even ran small reclamation side hustles, selling slightly dented spoons and mud-stained coins to people with no standards. In a few towns, the job came with free housing or food allowances, paid by the local guild or council. Not glamorous, but reliable. So next time you complain about your inbox being a mess, spare a thought for the medieval muckraker, raking through actual filth, so the rest of us could pretend cobblestones were quaint. Coming up, let's head back indoors to a role where the pressure was enormous, the judgment constant, and the failure rate distressingly high. Meet the medieval midwife, one of the few jobs reserved for women, and one of the most quietly heroic. In an age when medicine was still tangled up in humors, astrology, and guesswork, One profession quietly stood at the edge of life and death, day after day: the midwife. Forget silver spoons and sterile wards. The medieval midwife worked with little more than a sharp eye, steady hands, and years of experience, sometimes passed down from mother to daughter like a treasured family recipe. Her job? Help bring new life into the world. And, more often than not, prevent death from showing up uninvited. Midwives were almost always women. In fact, they were one of the few medically related roles allowed for women in the Middle Ages, though not without scrutiny. They were rarely formally trained. Instead, they learned through observation, apprenticeships, and hands-on experience. Some towns had licensed midwives who were officially recognized by the church or local authorities. Others worked informally, their reputations built entirely on word of mouth. "Oh yes, Mistress Alwyn helped with little Robert. Only screamed for 6 hours." Their clients ranged from poor peasants in straw-stuffed cottages to high-born ladies sweating through labor in stone chambers with damp tapestries and too many onlookers. Midwives didn't have forceps. Those wouldn't appear widely until the 17th century. Instead, they relied on oil, herbs, and warm water, linen cloths. Combs or crosses, for the mother to grip during contractions. Prayers. Lots and lots of prayers. Some used charms or recited religious phrases to encourage the baby. Others had herbal brews that worked as pain relief, muscle relaxants, or hopefully labor accelerants. None of it was guaranteed, and much of it was improvised. Midwives were also expected to baptize babies who seemed likely to die before a priest could arrive, and this was serious business. A failed baptism could, in the church's eyes, doom the soul, so the midwife had to act fast, decisively, and spiritually. High mortality. Childbirth was dangerous for both mother and baby. Complications like breech births, hemorrhaging, or infection were common and often fatal. Blame. If something went wrong, especially during a wealthy birth, the midwife could be accused of incompetence, negligence, or even witchcraft. In some regions, midwives were interrogated by local clergy if a baby died under suspicious circumstances. Witchcraft suspicions. Because they knew herbs, whispered prayers, and were associated with female-only spaces, midwives were often viewed with a mix of awe and suspicion. Some were accused of using magic during birth. Others were caught in witch hunts, and yet they kept working. They were vital, essential, trusted, at least by the women they helped. Midwives occupied a strange space in society. Not quite servants, not quite professionals. They were respected, needed, and yet excluded from many formal institutions. Men couldn't be midwives. It was considered inappropriate, and male doctors were only called in the most extreme cases, and even then, reluctantly. But in the village, the midwife was more than a birth assistant. She was a keeper of life cycles, present at birth, knowledgeable about death, asked for advice on fertility, menstruation, and miscarriage. In many ways, she was a quiet cornerstone of women's lives. Despite centuries of marginalization, midwives carried on. Their practical, compassionate care was the best many women ever received. Today's midwifery owes much to their endurance, their handwritten notes, their herbal knowledge, their belief that birth was something to be supported, not dominated. And while they didn't wear masks or scrub in, many midwives washed their hands regularly, used clean linens, and understood, even without germ theory, that cleanliness helped survival. So while the doctors theorized and the priests sermonized, the midwives just got on with it. Birth after birth, breath after breath, quietly shaping the future one slippery infant at a time. Next up, a far stranger job. Less blood, more words. Let's meet the professional mourner, hired not to save lives, but to weep convincingly over the end of one. Let's take a moment to consider something oddly theatrical: being paid to weep. Not just feeling sad, but wailing, sobbing, shrieking, and rending your garments for someone you may have never met. Welcome to the dramatic, strangely revered world of the professional mourner. In the Middle Ages, funerals weren't just somber affairs, they were performances. The louder the grief, the greater the honor paid to the dead. And when the family couldn't produce enough noise naturally, they simply hired it. Professional mourners were often women, typically older, widowed, or unattached, who had the skill and stamina to put on a truly memorable display of grief. Some were respected for their ability to channel emotion, while others were mocked as melodramatic. Either way, they got the job done. Known as keeners in Ireland, weeping women in other parts of Europe, or simply criers, they were the medieval version of dramatic flair, a walking, wailing tribute to the deceased. A professional mourner might be hired to attend the wake, the procession, and the funeral itself. Her duties included loudly mourning in public, chanting or singing dirges, recounting the virtues or dramatic failings of the deceased, encouraging others to weep harder, occasionally tearing hair, scratching cheeks, or beating her chest. Think of it as emotional crowd control, because in medieval culture, especially among wealthier families, a quiet funeral looked bad. If no one was crying, did anyone love the deceased? If there was no public grief, was their soul properly honored? Hiring mourners wasn't seen as fake, it was symbolic. These women served as extensions of the family's grief, ensuring the dead received proper emotional send-off, especially when the real family was either too overcome or too socially stiff to cry out loud. In some traditions, the more dramatic the mourning, the better chance the soul had of passing peacefully into the next life. A weeping woman wasn't just putting on a show. She was, in theory, helping the dead get to heaven, or at least making sure the village remembered they existed. In places like Ireland, keening was an art. The mourners would sing haunting laments, often improvised over the body. These could include the name and lineage of the deceased, a poetic review of their life, accusations against fate, death, or even the local priest. Calls for justice if the death was sudden or violent. The style was rhythmic, sometimes musical, and deeply emotional. A good keener could move a crowd to tears. A great one could make you cry for someone you'd never met. Elsewhere in Europe, mourning rituals included tolling bells, black cloth, and symbolic gestures. Mourners might walk barefoot, scatter ashes, or throw themselves to the ground. Again, for effect. Mourners were usually paid in coin, food, or gifts, often depending on the wealth of the deceased's family. In richer towns, some made a modest living from their work, moving from funeral to funeral like tragic celebrities. But the job came with stigma. Many considered professional mourning unseemly, especially if it appeared insincere. The church frowned on excessive keening or theatrical displays of grief, viewing it as bordering on pagan ritual. In some regions, mourning chants were outright banned. And, of course, the constant exposure to death wasn't easy. Mourners had to steel themselves emotionally. Even when they didn't know the deceased, the energy of the crowd could be overwhelming. And then there was the sheer physical strain of screaming for hours in a cold chapel, walking miles in a procession, and maintaining the role until the last prayer was said. So while some weepers were dramatic and others just doing their job, all of them played a vital part in how the medieval world processed loss. Loudly, publicly, and with enough volume to wake the dead, which was, ironically, not the goal. Next time, let's swap sorrow for mischief and peek into a profession that straddled comedy and crime, the jesters, fools, and licensed troublemakers of the court. Let's end on a high note, or at least a weirdly jingly one. Enter the jester, the fool, the court clown. He juggled, joked, danced, insulted kings to their faces, and somehow lived to see another day. In a world of plague, war, and terrible hygiene, jesters were the rare professionals paid to make people laugh, even when there wasn't much to laugh about. A jester was not just any funny person with a pointy hat and bells, though yes, they absolutely wore pointy hats with bells. These were entertainers employed by royal courts, noble households, or even traveling troops. Their job was to amuse, but also, occasionally, to speak truth to power in a way no one else dared. There were two main types: natural fools, people born with cognitive disabilities who were kept by noble families as living curiosities, a deeply problematic and sadly common practice. Licensed jesters, talented comedians, acrobats, mimics, or musicians who used wit, sarcasm, and slapstick to delight their audience. This block is about the second type, the real performers, the ones who sharpened their wit like a sword and danced through politics with jokes that could both charm and wound. A typical day for a jester might include telling jokes and riddles during meals, imitating nobles or mocking rival kings, playing lute or pipe, or performing comic songs, making satirical commentary about politics, court scandals, or even the king's bad haircut. They performed at banquets, festivals, and public ceremonies. Some were sent on diplomatic missions because who better to lighten the mood than someone in tights and bells? A skilled jester was more than a clown. They were entertainers, observers, and occasionally secret advisors. They had the rare license to offend, though that license could, and did, get revoked with a swift execution if they overstepped. The jester's greatest skill wasn't juggling, it was reading the room. Telling the right joke to the right person at the right time could earn you favor and coin. But one wrong word about the queen's cousin's bald spot, and you might find yourself fired, in the very final sense of the word. That said, jesters often got away with a lot. Why? Because they were considered harmless. Fools, not threats. This gave them a unique power. A jester could point out the king's hypocrisy in a rhyme or suggest an unpopular truth disguised as humor, and it would be brushed off as a joke until someone realized it wasn't. In a world of strict hierarchy and public execution, that was a kind of freedom almost no one else had. Triboulet, jester to King Francis I of France, once insulted a powerful courtier. The king, annoyed, promised he could choose how to die. Triboulet replied, "By old age." The king laughed and spared him. Will Sommers, jester to Henry VIII, remained in favor through multiple wives, wars, and the general horror that was Tudor politics. That's not comedy, that's survival instinct. Stańczek, the Polish jester, was a sharp political mind disguised as a clown. He appears in paintings as sad, thoughtful, and the only one who sees what's really going on. Coxcomb hat, that iconic tri-pointed cap with bells. Marat, a jester's stick or puppet, often shaped like a mini version of themselves. Bright, motley clothes. Patchwork, mismatched, and meant to attract attention, like a walking stage light. Sharp tongue, their most important tool, more dangerous than any sword. As court culture changed and centralized power became more image-conscious, the jester's position declined. By the 17th century, court jesters were mostly replaced by playwrights, poets, and professional performers in theaters. But the spirit lived on in satire, stand-up, political cartoons, and that one friend who always knows exactly how far they can push a joke. So while the jester might have looked foolish, their role was anything but. They danced along the edge of danger with a grin, slipping truth into laughter like a sugar cube into poison. And with that, we bow and take our leave. From gravediggers to alchemists, rat catchers to midwives, we've wandered through the strangest medieval careers you never saw in your high school history textbook. Now, let's pull it all together with a gentle wrap-up. And so we've reached the end of our strange little tour through the muddy, miraculous, often malodorous world of medieval jobs. You've met the rat catcher with a sack full of squealing clients, You've walked beside the resurrectionist, sneaking corpses through the fog. You've felt the quiet strength of a midwife, the weariness of a leech collector, and the sharp tongue of a court jester who could roast a king and still keep his head. These weren't glamorous roles. They weren't celebrated in stained glass or sung about in ballads, but they were real, and they kept the wheels of medieval life creaking forward. They remind us that history isn't just kings and castles. It's full of people in aprons, in cloaks, in mud-soaked boots, doing weird, necessary, often thankless things. And while we might laugh at the oddities, the professional mourners, the food tasters, the urine inspectors, we do it with a nod of respect, because in the end, it was their world. Strange, yes, but not so different from ours. So, dear listener, as you drift off tonight, let those images soften in your mind. A jester's last bow, a midwife's quiet smile, a town crier's voice fading into the dusk. Thanks for wandering the medieval streets with us. And hey, if you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell. Figuratively, of course. No shouting required. Sleep well, and may your dreams be free of leeches.